The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over downtown Montgomery, Alabama, casting long shadows between the towering courthouse buildings and the bustling city streets. The heat shimmered off the asphalt like waves, distorting the air and making everything appear dreamlike. It was the kind of day that made tempers run hot and patience run thin, especially in a city where tensions always seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Dexter Washington stood beside his modest sedan in the courthouse parking lot, methodically checking the meters and marking down license plates on his clipboard. At 52, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of years of experience and hard-won wisdom. His dark skin glistened slightly with perspiration in the Alabama heat, and his neatly pressed uniform polo shirt bore the insignia of the Montgomery Parking Authority. To anyone watching, he appeared to be nothing more than what his uniform suggested, a dedicated city employee doing his job with thoroughness and care. But appearances could be deceiving. Dexter moved with the measured precision of someone accustomed to authority, even in this humble role. His eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing as they swept across the parking lot. Years of reading people and situations had taught him to notice the details others overlooked. The slight nervousness of a driver rushing to their car, the defiance in someone's posture as they argued about a ticket, the way power dynamics played out in the smallest interactions. The parking lot was busy today, filled with lawyers, clerks, and citizens attending to courthouse business. The usual mixture of expensive sedans belonging to attorneys and older, more modest vehicles driven by those seeking justice created a patchwork of social status that Dexter had observed countless times. He treated every vehicle the same, regardless of its make or model, applying the parking regulations with fairness and consistency. Near the far end of the lot, a white patrol car sat in a space clearly marked for civilian use only. The vehicle had been there for over an hour, well beyond the 2-hour maximum, and Dexter had already made a note of it during his previous rounds. City regulations were clear. No one was exempt from parking rules unless they were responding to an emergency. This car was clearly not on any emergency call, its occupant nowhere to be seen. Dexter approached the patrol car, his footsteps echoing softly on the hot asphalt. He pulled out his citation book and began filling out the violation notice, his pen moving smoothly across the paper. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was ticketing a police vehicle, but rules were rules. He had learned long ago that justice required consistency, regardless of who might be inconvenienced. The sound of heavy footsteps on pavement made him look up. Officer Ryan Mitchell strode toward him with the kind of swagger that immediately set Dexter's internal alarms ringing. At 38, Mitchell was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with the kind of build that suggested hours spent in the gym. His blonde hair was cropped short in a military style, and his pale blue eyes held a coldness that seemed to calculate threat levels in everyone he encountered. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button polished to a gleam. But it was his expression that told Dexter everything he needed to know about this encounter. Mitchell's face was flushed with anger, his jaw set in the kind of rigid line that suggested barely controlled rage. His right hand hovered near his service weapon in a gesture that was probably unconscious but unmistakably threatening. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Mitchell's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade, loud enough to draw attention from other people in the parking lot. Several passers-by turned to watch, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Dexter straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of experience had taught him how to read volatile situations, and every instinct told him this one was about to escalate quickly. He kept his voice level and professional, the tone he had perfected through years of dealing with difficult people. "Sir, I'm issuing a parking citation for this vehicle. It's been parked in a 2-hour zone for over an hour and 20 minutes. Mitchell's face darkened further, the flush spreading down his neck. "That's my patrol car, you idiot. Cops don't get parking tickets." "I understand it's your vehicle, officer," Dexter replied calmly, continuing to write on his citation pad. However, city regulations apply to all vehicles unless they're responding to an active emergency call. Since your vehicle has been stationary for an extended period, I'm required to issue this citation." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mitchell stepped closer, close enough that Dexter could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the aggressive confidence he projected. The officer's body language screamed dominance and intimidation, tactics that had probably worked for him countless times before. "Are you seriously trying to tell me how to do my job?" Mitchell's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, but in the quiet of the parking lot, every word carried clearly. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Dexter met his gaze steadily, neither backing down nor becoming aggressive. "I'm not telling you how to do your job, officer. I'm doing mine. It was the wrong thing to say. Or perhaps it was exactly the right thing to say to expose Mitchell's true character." The officer's composure cracked completely, his professional mask slipping away to reveal something ugly underneath. His hand moved to his belt, fingers tapping against his radio as if considering calling for backup to deal with what he clearly saw as an uppity parking attendant who didn't know his place. "Listen here, boy," Mitchell said, the word dripping with venom and centuries of racial hatred. The term hung in the air like a slap, causing several nearby witnesses to gasp audibly. "You don't write tickets to police officers. You don't question police officers. And you sure as hell don't get smart with police officers. Do you understand me?" The racial slur hit Dexter like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. He had heard that word before, had faced its poison in various forms throughout his life, and he had learned not to let it derail him from his purpose. Instead, he continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the citation form. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back and allow me to complete my duties," Dexter said, his voice remaining remarkably calm despite the tension crackling in the air around them. "If you have concerns about this citation, you can address them through the proper channels." Mitchell's face contorted with rage. The idea that this parking attendant, this man he clearly saw as beneath him in every way, was refusing to back down seemed to short-circuit something in his brain. His breathing became more rapid, his stance more aggressive, and his voice rose to a shout that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "The proper channels?" Mitchell's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I am the proper channels, you piece of garbage. I'm a police officer, and you're nothing but a glorified meter maid. When I tell you to do something, you do it. When I tell you to stop, you stop. And when I tell you to show some respect, you damn well better show it." A crowd was beginning to gather now, drawn by the shouting and the obvious tension. Office workers on their lunch breaks, attorneys heading to court, citizens with business at the courthouse all stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. Some pulled out their phones, recognizing that they might be witnessing something significant. The awareness of the growing audience seemed to fuel Mitchell's aggression rather than temper it. Dexter finished writing the citation and tore it from his pad with a crisp, deliberate motion. He held it out toward Mitchell, his hand steady despite the volatile situation. "Here's your citation, officer. Have a good day." That was the moment Mitchell snapped completely. With a roar of rage that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, Mitchell lunged forward and shoved Dexter hard in the chest with both hands. The force of the impact sent Dexter stumbling backward, his clipboard and citation pad flying from his hands to scatter across the asphalt. He caught himself before falling, but the assault was clear and unmistakable to everyone watching. "How dare you!" Mitchell screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "How dare you disrespect me like that? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do to you?" The parking lot fell silent except for the sound of Mitchell's heavy breathing and the distant hum of traffic. The witnesses stood frozen, cell phone cameras recording every second of what had just occurred. Even in a state where police officers often operated with impunity, this was clearly over the line. A uniformed officer had just physically assaulted a city employee for doing his job. Dexter straightened his shirt and picked up his scattered papers with unhurried movements. His calm in the face of Mitchell's violence was almost more shocking than the assault itself. He looked directly at the officer, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to resonate in the stillness. "Officer Mitchell," he said, reading the name badge on the man's uniform, "I believe you've just made a serious error in judgment." Something in Dexter's tone, some subtle shift in his demeanor, caused Mitchell to pause. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across the officer's face. It was as if he suddenly sensed that he had miscalculated something important about the situation. But his rage was too hot, his pride too wounded to back down now. "Are you threatening me?" Mitchell snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Are you actually threatening a police officer?" "Not a threat," Dexter replied calmly, brushing dust off his clipboard. "An observation." Mitchell's confusion was visible now, warring with his anger. Something about this parking attendant's composure, his refusal to be intimidated, his calm confidence in the face of physical assault, was not matching the officer's expectations. But Mitchell was too deep into his rage to think clearly, too committed to his course of action to recognize the warning signs. "You know what?" Mitchell said, reaching for his handcuffs. "I think you need to learn some respect. You're under arrest for assaulting a police officer." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone had seen what happened, had watched Mitchell assault Dexter, not the other way around. The blatant lie was so obvious, so audacious, that it left people momentarily speechless. "I beg your pardon?" Dexter's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time, there was a hint of something other than calm in his voice. Not fear, not anger, but something that might have been amusement. "You heard me," Mitchell said, advancing with his handcuffs ready. "You assaulted me when you shoved that paper at me. Assault on a police officer is a felony, and you're going to jail." The lie was so transparent, so contradicted by what everyone had witnessed and what the cell phone cameras had recorded, that it would have been laughable if it weren't so serious. This was how the system worked, how officers like Mitchell operated. They created their own version of reality, secure in the knowledge that their word would be believed over anyone else's. But as Mitchell reached for Dexter's arm to cuff him, the parking attendant did something unexpected. He didn't resist. He didn't pull away or argue. Instead, he simply said, "Officer Mitchell, I'm going to give you one last chance to reconsider this course of action." "Are you crazy?" Mitchell laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the courthouse walls. "You're in no position to give me chances. You're under arrest." Dexter sighed softly, the sound somehow conveying both sadness and inevitability. "Very well, but I want you to remember this moment, officer. I want you to remember that I tried to warn you." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Dexter's wrists, he turned to look at the crowd of witnesses. His eyes found the phones recording the incident, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging their presence and their importance to what was about to unfold. "Make sure those recordings are preserved," he called out calmly. "They're going to be very important." Mitchell jerked him toward the patrol car, his grip unnecessarily rough. "Shut up and move. You've caused enough trouble for one day." As they walked toward the police vehicle, Dexter's mind was already working several moves ahead. He thought about the irony of the situation, about the cosmic justice of what was about to unfold. Mitchell had no idea what he had just set in motion, no understanding of the forces he had just awakened with his casual brutality and obvious lies. The patrol car's door slammed shut with Dexter in the back seat, and Mitchell climbed into the driver's seat, still muttering about disrespectful civilians who didn't know their place. As they drove away from the courthouse parking lot, heading for the city jail, neither man spoke. But the silence was filled with tension and the weight of consequences yet to come. In the parking lot they left behind, the witnesses slowly dispersed, but not before sharing contact information and making sure the video recordings were safely stored and backed up. Word began to spread through the courthouse and the surrounding legal community that something significant had just happened. Something that would have repercussions far beyond a simple parking citation. What none of them knew yet what Officer Ryan Mitchell was about to learn in the most humiliating way possible was that the quiet, dignified man he had just arrested was not simply a parking attendant. He was Judge Dexter Washington, the elected probate judge for Montgomery County, a position that gave him significant power over the very law enforcement system that had just wrongfully arrested him. And in 3 days, Officer Mitchell would be standing before him in court, seeking approval for a bond that would determine whether his own department could continue to operate. The wheels of justice, it seemed, were about to turn in ways that no one could have predicted. The Montgomery City Jail was a monument to bureaucratic indifference, its gray concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lighting designed to strip away dignity and hope from anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves inside. The booking area smelled of disinfectant and despair, with the constant sound of keys jingling, doors slamming, and the low murmur of conversations between inmates and officers creating a symphony of institutional misery. Dexter Washington sat on the hard metal bench in the holding cell, his back straight, despite the uncomfortable seating and the indignity of his situation. The bright orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to his usual professional attire. Even in this environment, surrounded by the chaos and degradation of the jail, he maintained his composure with an almost supernatural calm. The other inmates in the holding cell gave him curious looks. Here was a man who clearly didn't belong in this place, whose very presence seemed to elevate the grimy surroundings. He wasn't pacing frantically like the young man arrested for disturbing the peace, wasn't muttering angry threats like the drunk who had been brought in for public intoxication, and wasn't trying to negotiate his way out like the white-collar criminal who had been caught embezzling from his company. Instead, Dexter sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed in what might have been prayer or meditation. Every so often, he would glance at the clock on the wall, as if keeping track of time for some important appointment. The other inmates began to whisper among themselves, wondering who this mysterious man was and why he seemed so unconcerned about his predicament. Meanwhile, in the administrative offices of the jail, a different kind of chaos was brewing. Sergeant Lisa Parker, the night shift supervisor, was having the kind of evening that made her question her career choices. A 20-year veteran of law enforcement, she had seen it all during her time in both patrol and jail operations. But the arrest report she was reviewing for the man brought in by Officer Mitchell was raising red flags that had her seriously concerned. The report claimed that Dexter Washington, listed as a parking attendant, had assaulted Mitchell while the officer was conducting official business. But Parker knew Mitchell's reputation, knew his history of complaints, and his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. She also knew that assault charges against parking enforcement officers were extremely rare, especially ones that resulted in arrests rather than simple citations. Her concerns deepened when she ran Dexter's name through the system and found something that made her blood run cold. "Oh, sweet Jesus," she whispered, staring at her computer screen in disbelief. The database clearly showed Dexter Washington's full information. Judge Dexter Washington, probate judge for Montgomery County, elected to his current term 3 years ago, previously served as a circuit court judge for 8 years, and before that, spent 15 years as a public defender specializing in civil rights cases. Parker grabbed her phone and dialed Mitchell's extension, her hands trembling slightly. When he answered, she could hear the smugness in his voice. "Mitchell here. What's up, Sarge? Ryan, I need you to get down to my office right now. We have a serious problem." "What kind of problem?" "I just brought in some uppity parking attendant who thought he could mouth off to me." "Everything's handled." Parker closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Ryan, that parking attendant you arrested? He's Judge Dexter Washington, the probate judge, the one who has to approve the sheriff's department bond renewal next week." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Parker thought the call had been dropped. When Mitchell finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. "What did you just say?" "You arrested a sitting judge, Ryan. A judge who everyone in the courthouse knows, who's been on the bench for over a decade, and who happens to have oversight authority over our department's operational budget. The sound of Mitchell's chair squeaking as he apparently sat down heavily came through the phone. That's impossible. He was wearing a parking authority uniform. He was writing parking tickets. He told me he was a parking attendant. He told you he was doing his job, Parker said, pulling up more information on her screen. And according to what I'm seeing here, Judge Washington volunteers with the parking authority on weekends as part of a community service initiative he started. He wanted to understand city operations from the ground up. The implications of what had happened were starting to sink in, and Parker could almost hear Mitchell's career collapsing through the phone line. Arresting a judge on false charges wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of catastrophic error that ended careers and sometimes led to federal investigations. "Sarge," Mitchell's voice was barely above a whisper now. "What do we do?" Parker was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. All of them were bad. "First, you need to get down here immediately. Second, we need to figure out how to handle this before it becomes a complete disaster. And third, you better start praying that Judge Washington is more forgiving than most people would be in his situation." 20 minutes later, Mitchell stood in Parker's office, his face pale and his earlier arrogance completely deflated. The transformation was remarkable. The swaggering bully who had arrested Dexter had been replaced by a nervous man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. "Show me the arrest report," Parker said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Mitchell handed over the paperwork, his hands shaking slightly. Parker read through it carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each line. "Ryan, this report says Judge Washington assaulted you by aggressively shoving the parking citation at you. Is that really what happened?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was being disrespectful. He wouldn't back down when I told him not to write the ticket." "That's not what I asked you. I asked if he assaulted you." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of truth and consequences. Finally, Mitchell shook his head slightly. "Not exactly." "What does not exactly mean, Ryan?" "I might have pushed him first, but he was being disrespectful, and I was trying to assert my authority." Parker leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples where a headache was beginning to form. "So, let me get this straight. You physically assaulted a sitting judge because he was doing his job, then arrested him on false charges when he didn't back down from your intimidation?" When she put it like that, Mitchell realized how bad it sounded. "I didn't know he was a judge." "Would it have mattered if you had known?" Mitchell started to answer automatically, then stopped. The honest answer was that yes, it would have mattered. He never would have spoken to a judge the way he had spoken to Dexter. He never would have pushed a judge, never would have arrested a judge on trumped-up charges. His behavior had been based entirely on his assumption that Dexter was powerless, someone he could bully without consequences. "This is bad, Ryan. This is really, really bad." Before Mitchell could respond, Parker's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face went pale. "It's the chief," she said, answering the call. "Chief Morrison." "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here in my office right now. Yes, I understand the seriousness of the situation." Mitchell watched Parker's face grow increasingly grim as she listened to their superior. After several minutes of mostly one-sided conversation, she hung up and turned to him with an expression that made his stomach drop. "The chief wants to see you in his office first thing in the morning. He's already been contacted by the mayor's office, the city attorney, and 3 different news stations. Apparently, there's video of the entire incident, and it's already starting to circulate on social media." Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face. "Video? Multiple videos from multiple angles, and Ryan, they don't support your version of events at all." The next few hours passed in a blur of damage control meetings, phone calls with lawyers, and increasingly frantic attempts to figure out how to minimize the fallout from Mitchell's actions. Word spread quickly through the law enforcement community, and reactions ranged from disbelief to anger to resignation. Everyone knew that this kind of incident reflected poorly on all police officers, not just the one who had made the mistake. As dawn broke over Montgomery, Judge Washington was finally processed for release. The charges against him had been quietly dropped, though the arrest would remain on record pending a full investigation. He emerged from the holding cell looking exactly as composed as when he had entered, his dignity intact despite the night's ordeal. Sergeant Parker met him at the discharge desk, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and professional concern. "Judge Washington," she said formally, "I want to apologize on behalf of the department for what happened yesterday. This should never have occurred." Dexter nodded politely as he signed the release paperwork. "Sergeant Parker, I appreciate your professionalism throughout this process. You've handled a difficult situation with grace." Parker was struck by his calm demeanor and his complete lack of anger or vindictiveness. Most people who had been wrongfully arrested and spent the night in jail would be furious, threatening lawsuits and demanding heads roll. But Judge Washington seemed almost serene, as if he had expected this outcome all along. "Sir, if I may ask, why didn't you identify yourself to Officer Mitchell? This entire situation could have been avoided if he had known who you were." Dexter paused in his signing and looked up at her with eyes that seemed much older than his years. "Sergeant, do you believe that the law should apply differently based on who a person is?" "Well, no, but..." "Then you understand why I didn't reveal my identity. Every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement, regardless of their station in life. If Officer Mitchell was willing to assault and falsely arrest someone he thought was just a parking attendant, then the problem isn't that he didn't know who I was. The problem is much deeper than that." His words hung in the air as he finished the paperwork and gathered his personal belongings. As he prepared to leave, he turned back to Parker one more time. "Sergeant, I want you to know that I don't hold you or the vast majority of your officers responsible for what happened. But Officer Mitchell's actions yesterday were not just an insult to me personally. They were an attack on the principles of justice and equality that our entire system depends upon." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "I'll see you all in court next week for the bond hearing. I trust that will be an interesting meeting." And with that, Judge Dexter Washington walked out of the Montgomery City Jail, leaving behind a group of increasingly nervous law enforcement officials who were beginning to realize that their problems were just beginning. As news of the arrest spread throughout the legal community and beyond, reactions ranged from outrage to disbelief to calls for immediate action. The Montgomery Bar Association issued a statement condemning the arrest. Civil rights organizations began planning protests, and social media exploded with commentary and analysis of the incident. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. The courthouse custodial staff, parking enforcement officers, clerks, and other support personnel who had always been treated respectfully by Judge Washington, but had watched him be dismissed and disrespected by others who thought their positions made them more important. These were the people who saw everything, who knew which lawyers treated their secretaries well and which ones screamed at them for minor mistakes. They knew which judges were fair and which ones played favorites. And they knew that Judge Washington was different, that he treated everyone with the same courtesy and respect regardless of their position or status. Word spread quickly through this unofficial network, and by the time Judge Washington returned to his chambers the next morning, he found something remarkable waiting for him. Every parking enforcement officer in the city had requested to attend the upcoming bond hearing. The courthouse maintenance staff had volunteered to work extra hours to ensure the courtroom was in perfect condition. The clerks and secretaries had prepared detailed files on every aspect of the sheriff's department's bond requirements. Most importantly, the security camera operators had compiled every angle of footage from the parking lot incident, creating a comprehensive video record that would make any attempt to spin or distort the truth impossible. Judge Washington sat in his chambers, surrounded by the evidence of the community that had formed around him, and for the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself a small smile. Justice, he knew, was about more than laws and courtrooms and formal procedures. It was about people standing up for what was right, about communities coming together to support truth over power, and about the understanding that real authority came not from badges or titles but from character and integrity. Officer Mitchell had made the mistake of thinking that his uniform gave him the right to treat others with disrespect and violence. He was about to learn that true power came from a very different source, and that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond anything he could have imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the individuals involved, but the entire system of justice they all served. The law offices of Johnson, Stevens, and Associates occupied the entire 15th floor of the Montgomery Financial Center, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Alabama River and the city sprawling beyond. The office was a monument to success, with its polished marble floors, expensive artwork, and the kind of furniture that whispered rather than shouted about wealth and influence. Harold Stevens, senior partner and one of Montgomery's most prominent defense attorneys, sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing the case file that had landed on his desk that morning. At 68, Stevens was a legend in Alabama legal circles, having built his reputation defending police officers, politicians, and other powerful figures who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored, and his demeanor radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning cases that others considered unwinnable. But as he read through the details of Officer Ryan Mitchell's case, even Stevens felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Across from him sat Police Chief William Morrison, a man whose 25-year career in law enforcement had weathered numerous storms, but nothing quite like this. Morrison was in his early 50s, built like the college linebacker he had once been, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with the darker side of human nature. Today, however, he looked every one of his years, and then some. "Harold," Morrison said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept in 2 days, "I need you to tell me straight. How bad is this?" Stevens removed his reading glasses and set them carefully on the desk. He had known Morrison for over a decade, had represented several of his officers in various incidents, and had always been able to find a path through even the most difficult situations. But this case was different in ways that made his experienced attorney's instincts scream warnings. "Bill, in 35 years of practicing law, I've never seen a more straightforward case of police misconduct with so much evidence to support it. The video footage alone is devastating, but that's not even the worst part." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his jaw clenched. "What's the worst part?" "The worst part is that your officer assaulted and falsely arrested the one person in this city who has direct authority over your department's bond. Judge Washington doesn't just have the power to make Mitchell's life difficult. He has the power to effectively shut down your entire operation." The implications hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Every law enforcement agency in Alabama operated under bonds that had to be renewed periodically, financial guarantees that allowed them to function and that could be revoked if they were found to be operating improperly or unsafely. The probate judge had significant discretionary power in reviewing and approving these bonds, power that was rarely exercised but was very real. "Can he really do that?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Legally, yes. The probate judge has broad authority to review the operational fitness of law enforcement agencies when considering bond renewals. If Judge Washington determines that your department has systemic problems with officer conduct, he could delay or deny the bond renewal pending reforms." Stevens pulled out a thick legal folder and spread its contents across his desk. "I've been researching Judge Washington's background, and what I've found is both good news and bad news for us." "Give me the bad news first." "The bad news is that he's exactly the kind of judge we don't want to face in a situation like this. His background as a civil rights attorney means he understands these issues better than most. His reputation for fairness is impeccable, which means we can't attack his credibility. And his track record shows that he doesn't back down from difficult decisions, even when they're politically unpopular." Morrison rubbed his temples where a headache was building. "And the good news?" The good news is that same reputation for fairness means he's likely to give us a genuine hearing rather than simply railroading Mitchell for revenge. If we can present a compelling case for systemic reforms and demonstrate real accountability, he might be willing to work with us rather than against us. The door to Stevens' office opened and his secretary announced that Officer Mitchell had arrived. Morrison and Stevens exchanged a look, both men bracing themselves for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Mitchell entered the office looking like a man who had aged years in the past few days. His usually perfect posture was slumped, his confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy, and his eyes darted around the room as if looking for exits. He had clearly been watching the news coverage and reading the social media commentary about his actions, and the weight of public scrutiny was taking its toll. "Ryan," Morrison said, gesturing to a chair, "Mr. Stevens needs to ask you some questions about what happened. I need you to be completely honest with him. No stories, no justifications, just the truth." Mitchell sat down heavily, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Chief, I want you to know that I never intended for this to become such a big deal. I was just trying to do my job." Stevens leaned forward slightly, his practiced eye noting every detail of Mitchell's body language and tone. "Officer Mitchell, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I need direct answers. The success of your defense and potentially the future of your entire department depends on your honesty here." Mitchell nodded, though his discomfort was obvious. "First question, did you know that Dexter Washington was a judge when you encountered him in the parking lot?" "No, sir, I had no idea. He was wearing a parking authority uniform and writing tickets." "Second question, when you demanded that he stop writing the citation for your vehicle, how did he respond?" Mitchell shifted in his chair. "He told me that city regulations applied to all vehicles unless they were responding to an emergency. He said he was required to issue the citation. Was he aggressive or threatening in his response?" "Not exactly aggressive, but he was defiant. He wouldn't back down when I told him to stop." Stevens made a note on his legal pad. "Third question, who initiated physical contact during the confrontation?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Mitchell's face flushed and his eyes dropped to his hands. Morrison leaned forward, his expression stern. "Ryan, answer the question." "I did," Mitchell said quietly. "I pushed him first, but he was being disrespectful, and I was trying to establish authority." "And after you pushed Judge Washington, what happened?" "He stepped back to regain his balance, but he didn't fight back or threaten me. He just picked up his papers and continued with the citation." Stevens continued making notes, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite his growing concern about the case. "Final question. When you arrested Judge Washington for assault, had he actually assaulted you in any way?" Mitchell's response was barely audible. "No, sir." The admission hung in the air like a guilty verdict. Morrison closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the full scope of the disaster now clear to him. Stevens continued writing for a moment, then set down his pen and looked directly at Mitchell. "Officer Mitchell, I want you to understand the situation you're in. You physically assaulted a sitting judge, then arrested him on false charges when he refused to be intimidated. This isn't just a criminal matter, it's a constitutional crisis that could have ramifications far beyond your individual case." Mitchell's face went pale. "What kind of ramifications?" Stevens consulted his notes before responding. "Civil rights violations under federal law, potential federal investigation of your entire department, massive civil liability for the city, and complete destruction of your career in law enforcement. And that's assuming Judge Washington doesn't decide to make an example of this case." Morrison stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "Harold, what are our options here?" "Realistically, very limited. The video evidence is clear and contradicts Officer Mitchell's arrest report. We have multiple witnesses who saw the assault, and we have Mitchell's own admission that he initiated physical contact and filed false charges." Stevens turned back to Mitchell, his expression grave. "Your best option, and possibly the department's only option, is complete accountability, full admission of wrongdoing, acceptance of responsibility, and cooperation with any reforms Judge Washington might require. "You're talking about throwing me under the bus," Mitchell said, his voice rising with desperation. "I'm talking about salvaging what can be salvaged from a disaster of your own making," Stevens replied coolly. "If you fight this, if you try to maintain the lies in your arrest report, you'll lose everything and you'll take the entire department down with you." Morrison turned from the window, his face set in the hard lines of a man making difficult decisions. "Ryan, Mr. Stevens is right. Your actions have put everyone in an impossible position. The only way forward is complete honesty and acceptance of consequences." The conversation continued for another hour, with Stevens laying out the legal realities and Morrison explaining the departmental implications. By the time Mitchell left the office, the strategy was clear: complete cooperation, full accountability, and hope that Judge Washington's reputation for fairness would extend to Mercy. But even as they planned their approach, none of them fully understood what they were up against. Meanwhile, across town, in the modest offices of the Montgomery County Public Defender, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. Keisha Johnson sat at her desk, surrounded by law books, case files, and printouts of news articles about the incident. At 34, she was already considered one of the most effective civil rights attorneys in Alabama, having built her reputation defending the powerless against institutional abuse. Her dark skin and natural hair had made her a target for discrimination early in her career, but her brilliant legal mind and fierce dedication to justice had earned her respect even from those who might have preferred to dismiss her. Today, she was preparing for what might be the most important case of her career, though not in the way anyone might expect. Judge Washington had called her that morning with an unusual request. Rather than seeking her representation as his attorney, he wanted her to serve as a consultant on the broader implications of the case. He was concerned that the focus on his individual situation might overshadow the systemic issues that the incident had revealed. "Keisha," he had said during their phone conversation, "this isn't about my pride or even about justice for me personally. This is about what happens to the next person who encounters an officer like Mitchell, someone who doesn't have a judge's title to protect them." Now, as she reviewed the evidence and prepared her analysis, Keisha was struck by the unique opportunity the case presented. It wasn't often that the system's failures were so clearly documented, or that someone with Judge Washington's authority was positioned to address them comprehensively. Her research had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Officer Mitchell that stretched back years. Citizens had reported excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of authority, but their complaints had been largely ignored or dismissed. The system had protected Mitchell, allowing his behavior to escalate until he finally made the mistake of targeting someone with the power to fight back. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant announced that Jerome Williams was there to see her. Jerome entered carrying a thick folder under his arm, his expression grim but determined. As the president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, Jerome had been following the case closely and had spent the past 2 days gathering information from the community. "Keisha," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "you need to see what we found." He opened the folder and spread out dozens of sworn statements, police reports, and incident documentation. "We put out the word that we were looking for anyone who had negative encounters with Officer Mitchell." The response was overwhelming. Keisha scanned the documents, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "How many people came forward?" 47. "And those are just the ones willing to go on record. The stories are remarkably consistent. Aggressive behavior, racial slurs, excessive force, and false charges when people didn't immediately submit to his authority." One particular report caught Keisha's attention. It detailed an incident from 2 years earlier where Mitchell had arrested a teenage boy for suspicious behavior that turned out to be nothing more than walking home from school through a predominantly white neighborhood. The charges had been dropped, but not before the boy spent the night in juvenile detention. "This is a pattern," Keisha said, more to herself than to Jerome. "This isn't about one bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment. This is about systematic abuse of power." Jerome nodded grimly. "And it gets worse. We found evidence that complaints against Mitchell were routinely dismissed or buried by his supervisors. The department knew about his behavior and chose to ignore it." Keisha leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. "Jerome, this changes everything. Judge Washington's case isn't an isolated incident. It's the culmination of years of unchecked abuse." "That's exactly what we think. And we believe Judge Washington is in a unique position to address not just Mitchell's behavior, but the system that enabled it." They spent the next several hours organizing the evidence and preparing a comprehensive report. By the time they finished, they had documented a clear pattern of misconduct that implicated not just Mitchell, but the supervisors and administrators who had failed in their duty to hold him accountable. As evening approached, Keisha made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. She picked up her phone and dialed Judge Washington's number. "Judge, it's Keisha. I need to meet with you tonight. What we've found is bigger than we thought, and it's going to change how you approach the bond hearing." An hour later, they met at Judge Washington's home, the same modest house where he had revealed his identity to his original attorney days earlier. The living room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant sound of evening traffic. Judge Washington listened intently as Keisha and Jerome presented their findings. His expression remained calm, but Keisha could see the anger building in his eyes as they detailed complaint after complaint that had been ignored or dismissed. "Judge," Keisha said as they concluded their presentation, "this bond hearing isn't just about whether the sheriff's department can continue operating. It's about whether you're going to allow a system that protects abusive officers to continue unchanged." Judge Washington was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap as he considered everything he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience and the authority of his office. "Keisha, Jerome, what you've shown me here confirms what I suspected from the moment Officer Mitchell put his hands on me. This wasn't about one officer having a bad day. This was about a culture that believes some people are worth more than others, that some lives matter more than others." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. "The question is, what do we do about it?" "You have more power than anyone to force real change," Jerome said. "The bond hearing gives you leverage that no one else has." "But with great power comes great responsibility," Judge Washington replied. "If I use my authority inappropriately, I become part of the problem rather than part of the solution." Keisha leaned forward in her chair. "Judge, what if there was a way to use your authority not for revenge, but for reform? What if the bond hearing became a catalyst for systemic change rather than just punishment for one officer?" Judge Washington turned from the window, his interest clearly piqued. "What did you have in mind?" "A consent decree. Use the bond hearing to require comprehensive reforms of the police department. Training, accountability measures, citizen oversight, transparent complaint processes. Make the bond conditional on real change." The idea hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility. Judge Washington had the legal authority to require such reforms as a condition of bond approval, and the documented pattern of abuse provided more than enough justification. "It would be unprecedented," Judge Washington said thoughtfully, "and it would certainly be controversial." "But it would be legal," Keisha replied, "and it would be just." Jerome added, "Judge, you have the chance to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. You can use your position to protect people who don't have the power to protect themselves." Judge Washington returned to his chair, his decision-making process visible in his thoughtful expression. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, but if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. I want a comprehensive reform package that addresses every aspect of police misconduct. I want community input, expert consultation, and a timeline for implementation that ensures real change." And I want it all documented and presented as part of the bond hearing so that everyone understands this isn't about personal revenge, but about institutional accountability. As they began planning the details of their reform proposal, none of them realized that their conversation was about to set in motion events that would reshape law enforcement not just in Montgomery, but potentially across the entire state of Alabama. The bond hearing was still days away, but the battle lines were already being drawn. On one side, a police department and legal system desperately trying to minimize the damage from Officer Mitchell's actions. On the other, a judge with the power to demand real change and a community finally ready to support him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the individuals involved, but the very foundations of justice and accountability in American law enforcement. The Montgomery County Courthouse had never seen a morning quite like this one. By 7 o'clock, 3 hours before the scheduled bond hearing, a crowd had already gathered on the courthouse steps. Local news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Alabama sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters checked their equipment and rehearsed their opening lines while camera crews jockeyed for the best positions to capture the arriving participants. The crowd was a fascinating mixture of Montgomery's diverse population. Civil rights activists stood alongside courthouse employees, retired lawyers mingled with college students, and longtime residents who remembered the civil rights struggles of the 1960s shared space with young people who had learned about the case through social media. The common thread binding them all together was a sense that they were about to witness something historic. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was equally charged but far more tense. Court clerks moved with unusual urgency. Security guards checked and rechecked their protocols, and the building's administrative staff prepared for what everyone expected to be an unprecedented day in Montgomery County legal history. Judge Dexter Washington arrived at his chambers at 8 o'clock, 2 hours earlier than usual. He wore his customary black robes with the dignity and authority that had marked his entire judicial career, but those who knew him well could detect subtle signs of the weight he was carrying. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a moment that would define not only his legacy, but potentially the future of police accountability in Alabama. His chambers, usually a quiet sanctuary of legal books and thoughtful reflection, buzzed with activity. Keisha Johnson sat at the conference table, surrounded by carefully organized stacks of documents, precedent cases, and the sworn statements from community members who had experienced misconduct at the hands of Officer Mitchell and others. Her preparation had been meticulous, every argument researched and every fact verified multiple times. "Judge," she said, looking up from her notes, "the consent decree proposal is ready for presentation. We've incorporated input from police reform experts, community leaders, and constitutional law scholars. It's comprehensive but achievable." Judge Washington reviewed the thick document she handed him, noting the careful balance between accountability and practicality. The proposed reforms included mandatory bias training, body camera requirements, civilian oversight boards, transparent complaint processes, and regular community meetings. Each element was designed to address the systemic issues that had allowed Officer Mitchell's behavior to continue unchecked for years. "This is excellent work, Keisha, but I want to be absolutely certain that every requirement we impose is legally sound and practically enforceable. The last thing I want is for this to be overturned on appeal due to procedural errors." Jerome Williams entered the chambers carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of somber expression that suggested he understood the gravity of the moment. As president of the local NAACP chapter, he had seen plenty of promises for police reform over the years, most of which had resulted in minimal change and business as usual. But this case felt different, powered by an unusual combination of documented evidence, legal authority, and community support. "Judge," Jerome said, settling into a chair at the conference table, "the community response has been overwhelming. We've had requests from civil rights organizations across the state asking permission to observe the hearing. The story has gone national, and there are groups coming in from Atlanta, Birmingham, and even as far away as Washington, D.C. Judge Washington nodded thoughtfully. While he appreciated the support, he was also concerned about managing the proceedings in a way that maintained the dignity and legal integrity of the courtroom. This couldn't become a circus, no matter how important the underlying issues. What about the other side? Any word on how the police department and city are preparing? Keisha consulted her notes. According to our sources, they've brought in Harold Stevens to represent Officer Mitchell, and the city attorney's office is handling the department's interests. Word is that they're planning to focus on Mitchell as an individual problem rather than addressing systemic issues. That's exactly what I expected, Judge Washington replied. They'll try to isolate this as one bad officer making one bad decision, rather than acknowledging the pattern of behavior and institutional failures that enabled it. At that same moment, 3 blocks away in the Montgomery Police Department's administrative building, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. Chief Morrison sat in the conference room with Harold Stevens, the city attorney, and several department supervisors, all trying to develop a strategy that would minimize the damage to the department while keeping Officer Mitchell out of prison. The mood in the room was grim. The past few days had brought a steady stream of bad news, media investigations uncovering additional complaints against Mitchell, federal officials asking questions about the department's oversight procedures, and mounting pressure from the mayor's office to resolve the situation quickly and quietly. "Harold," Chief Morrison said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept well in days. "What are we looking at here? Worst-case scenario." Stevens removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes before responding. "Worst case? Judge Washington uses the bond hearing to impose comprehensive federal oversight of your department. Mitchell goes to prison for civil rights violations, and the city faces millions of dollars in civil liability from past misconduct cases that will inevitably be reopened." The city attorney, a thin man named David Barnes, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, leaned forward nervously. "Can Judge Washington really do that? Can he use a bond hearing to impose reform requirements?" "Legally, yes," Stevens replied. "The probate judge has broad discretionary authority when it comes to public safety bonds. If he determines that the police department represents a risk to public safety, he can impose whatever conditions he deems necessary for bond approval." Chief Morrison slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "This is insane. One officer makes a mistake and the entire department gets punished for it?" Stevens fixed him with a steady gaze. "Bill, let's be clear about something. This isn't about one mistake. We both know that Mitchell has been a problem for years, and the department has consistently failed to address his behavior. Judge Washington isn't just responding to one incident, he's responding to a pattern of institutional failure. The truth of that statement hung in the air like an indictment. Morrison had received complaints about Mitchell's behavior for years, but had always found ways to minimize or dismiss them. The officer was effective at making arrests and had support from certain segments of the community who appreciated his aggressive approach to law enforcement. It had been easier to manage the complaints than to address the underlying problems. "So what do we do?" Morrison asked, his voice quieter now. "We go in there, we accept responsibility for what happened, and we hope that Judge Washington is more interested in reform than revenge," Stevens replied. "And we pray that Mitchell doesn't say anything stupid on the witness stand." Speaking of Mitchell, the officer in question was at that moment sitting in a small interview room in Stevens' law office, trying to prepare for what would likely be the most important testimony of his life. The confident, swaggering police officer who had arrested Judge Washington had been replaced by a nervous, uncertain man who was beginning to understand the full scope of the forces arrayed against him. Stevens had been blunt about Mitchell's prospects. The video evidence was devastating, his arrest report was demonstrably false, and his own admissions to his superiors had eliminated any possibility of maintaining his innocence. The only question now was whether he would cooperate fully with accountability measures or try to fight and lose everything. "Officer Mitchell," Stevens said, reviewing his notes one final time, "when you take the stand today, the only thing that might save your career and keep you out of prison is complete honesty. No justifications, no explanations about being disrespected, no attempts to blame Judge Washington for your actions. Just the truth." Mitchell nodded, though his discomfort was obvious. "Mr. Stevens, what happens if I tell the truth? What happens to me?" "If you tell the truth and accept responsibility, you might be able to plea bargain to lesser charges and keep your pension. If you lie or try to justify your actions, you'll face federal civil rights charges and lose everything." The choice, when Stevens laid it out that starkly, was really no choice at all. By 9:30, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. The main courtroom had been selected for the hearing, and every seat was filled with a mixture of community members, legal professionals, law enforcement officers, and reporters. Additional attendees filled the hallway outside, and court staff had set up speakers so the overflow crowd could listen to the proceedings. Judge Washington entered the courtroom at exactly 10 o'clock, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. The room fell silent as he took his seat at the bench, the only sound the soft rustle of clothing as hundreds of people rose respectfully. "Be seated," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "This court is now in session for the matter of the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department bond renewal hearing." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the packed courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members, the nervous expressions of the police officials, and the determined looks of the civil rights advocates. "Before we begin, I want to address the unusual circumstances surrounding this hearing. As many of you know, I was personally involved in an incident with Officer Ryan Mitchell that has raised serious questions about police conduct and accountability in our community." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Judge Washington continued without pause. "I have consulted with judicial ethics experts and received guidance that my personal experience, rather than disqualifying me from this proceeding, actually provides important context for evaluating the public safety implications of the Sheriff's Department's operations." He leaned forward slightly, his expression grave but determined. "This hearing will not be about personal revenge or individual vendettas. It will be about whether the Sheriff's Department, as currently constituted and managed, can be trusted with the significant responsibility of maintaining public safety in Montgomery County." The formality of his words couldn't disguise their explosive implications. Judge Washington wasn't just reviewing a routine bond renewal, he was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of the police department's fitness to serve the community. "We will hear testimony from multiple witnesses, review documentary evidence, and examine the policies and procedures that govern police conduct in our jurisdiction. At the conclusion of this hearing, I will determine whether the current bond should be renewed unconditionally, renewed with conditions, or denied pending substantial reforms." Harold Stevens rose from his seat at the defense table. "Your Honor, if I may, the defense would like to object to the scope of this hearing. The bond renewal should be a routine administrative matter, not a comprehensive review of departmental policies." Judge Washington's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. Stevens, the scope of this hearing is within my discretionary authority as probate judge. If you have concerns about procedural irregularities, you may address them through the appropriate appellate channels after we conclude." Stevens sat down, realizing that his objection had been both futile and potentially counterproductive. Judge Washington was operating well within his legal authority, and challenging him publicly would only reinforce the impression that the police department was more interested in avoiding accountability than addressing problems. "Very well," Judge Washington continued. "We will begin with testimony from Officer Ryan Mitchell regarding the incident that has brought us here today." Mitchell rose slowly from his seat, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he walked to the witness stand. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of his footsteps on the polished floor and the occasional click of a camera shutter from the media section. As Mitchell was sworn in, Judge Washington studied him carefully. This was the man who had called him boy, who had shoved him for doing his job, who had arrested him on false charges. But Judge Washington's expression remained professionally neutral, giving no indication of personal animosity or prejudgment. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Washington began, his voice steady and formal, "please tell this court, in your own words, what happened on the afternoon of October 15th when you encountered me in the courthouse parking lot." Mitchell cleared his throat nervously, glancing at his attorney before beginning to speak. What happened next would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of police accountability in Montgomery County and beyond. The moment of truth had finally arrived. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat in the witness chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The packed courtroom seemed to press in around him, hundreds of faces watching his every movement, waiting for words that would either begin his path toward redemption or complete his destruction. Judge Washington leaned back in his chair, his expression patient but expectant. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Mitchell finally found his voice. "Your Honor," Mitchell began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to start by saying that I am deeply sorry for my actions on October 15th. He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "When I approached you in the parking lot that day, I was angry about getting a parking ticket. Instead of handling the situation professionally, I let my emotions control my behavior." Judge Washington remained silent, his steady gaze encouraging Mitchell to continue. "You were doing your job, writing a citation for my vehicle that had exceeded the time limit in the parking zone. When you explained the regulations to me, I should have accepted the citation and handled any concerns through proper channels. Instead, I became aggressive and confrontational." Mitchell's voice grew stronger as he continued, the words seeming to flow more easily once he had committed to telling the truth. "I used racial language that was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I called you boy, which I know is offensive and hurtful. There's no excuse for that language, and I take full responsibility for using it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom at this admission. Many people had heard rumors about what Mitchell had said, but hearing him acknowledge it publicly carried significant weight. "When you continued to write the citation and explained that you were simply doing your job, I became even more angry. I felt like you were disrespecting my authority as a police officer, and I reacted by pushing you." Mitchell looked directly at Judge Washington for the first time since taking the stand. "You did not assault me, Your Honor. You did not threaten me or reach for my weapon. You remained calm and professional throughout our encounter, even after I had physically assaulted you. The arrest report I filed claiming that you had assaulted me was false." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Even though many people had suspected this was the case, hearing Mitchell admit to filing a false police report was shocking. Judge Washington raised his hand for silence before speaking. "Officer Mitchell, are you testifying under oath that you knowingly filed a false police report?" "Yes, Your Honor. I was angry and embarrassed, and I thought I could justify my actions by claiming that you had been aggressive toward me. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it." Harold Stevens, sitting at the defense table, closed his eyes briefly. While Mitchell's honesty was the only path forward, each admission was another nail in the coffin of his law enforcement career. Judge Washington continued his questioning. "Officer Mitchell, in your training and experience as a police officer, what are the consequences for filing false reports?" "It's grounds for immediate termination and criminal prosecution," Mitchell replied, his voice growing quieter again. "And yet you chose to file a false report anyway. Can you explain your reasoning?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. Finally, he looked up with an expression of genuine remorse. "Your Honor, I think I filed that false report because I couldn't accept that someone I saw as beneath me had refused to back down when I tried to intimidate them. I thought my badge gave me the right to treat people however I wanted, especially people I thought couldn't fight back." The honesty of this admission sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Mitchell wasn't just admitting to specific wrongdoing, he was acknowledging a fundamental attitude problem that had driven his behavior. Judge Washington leaned forward slightly. Officer Mitchell, is this the first time you've used your position as a police officer to intimidate or mistreat citizens? Stevens half rose from his chair, clearly considering an objection, but Mitchell was already answering. No, Your Honor, it's not. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped taking notes, too shocked by the admission to remember their duties. Can you elaborate on that statement? Mitchell took a deep breath, clearly making a decision to complete his confession regardless of the personal consequences. Over the years, I've used excessive force during arrests when it wasn't necessary. I've made traffic stops based on racial profiling rather than legitimate suspicions of wrongdoing. I've written reports that exaggerated suspects' behavior to justify my actions, and I've treated citizens, particularly citizens of color, with disrespect and hostility. Judge Washington's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him could see the controlled anger in his eyes. Officer Mitchell, were your supervisors aware of these behaviors? Mitchell glanced toward Chief Morrison, who was sitting in the gallery looking like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Some of them were, Your Honor. I've had complaints filed against me over the years. Most of them were dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions like written warnings or short suspensions. And did these disciplinary actions change your behavior? No, sir. If anything, they convinced me that I could get away with almost anything as long as I was careful about how I documented it. Judge Washington made several notes before continuing. Officer Mitchell, do you believe your behavior and attitudes are common among officers in the Montgomery Police Department? This question clearly made Mitchell uncomfortable. Answering it honestly would implicate his colleagues and supervisors, but lying under oath would destroy any credibility he might have built through his previous admissions. Your Honor, I think there are cultural problems in the department that make it easier for officers like me to develop bad habits and attitudes. There's not enough accountability, not enough training on constitutional rights and de-escalation, and not enough consequences for misconduct. The implications of this testimony were staggering. Mitchell wasn't just confessing to individual wrongdoing, he was describing systemic failures that affected the entire police department. Judge Washington concluded his questioning and turned to the other attorneys. Does counsel for the city or the sheriff's department have any questions for this witness? David Barnes, the city attorney, stood nervously. He faced an impossible situation. Challenging Mitchell's testimony would undermine their strategy of accepting responsibility, but allowing it to stand unchallenged was devastating to the department's reputation. Officer Mitchell, Barnes began carefully, when you describe cultural problems in the police department, are you referring to official policies or to informal attitudes among some officers? Both, Mitchell replied without hesitation. The official policies aren't strong enough to prevent misconduct, and the informal culture actively discourages reporting problems or challenging colleagues' behavior. Barnes sat down quickly, realizing that his question had only made things worse. Judge Washington called for a brief recess, during which the courtroom buzzed with conversation about Mitchell's devastating testimony. When proceedings resumed, he called Chief Morrison to the stand. Morrison approached the witness chair with the bearing of a career law enforcement officer, but his confidence had been badly shaken by Mitchell's admissions. As he was sworn in, he looked like a man preparing for his own professional execution. Chief Morrison, Judge Washington began, you've heard Officer Mitchell's testimony about his behavior and about cultural problems within your department. Do you agree with his assessment? Morrison had clearly prepared for this question, but Mitchell's comprehensive confession had made his planned response obsolete. Your Honor, I believe Officer Mitchell's behavior was unacceptable and does not represent the values or standards of the Montgomery Police Department. However, I also recognize that we may have systemic issues that need to be addressed. May have issues, Chief Morrison? Officer Mitchell has just testified under oath about years of misconduct, inadequate supervision, and a culture that tolerates abuse. Are you disputing his testimony? Morrison realized he was trapped between contradicting his own officer and admitting to massive institutional failures. No, Your Honor, I'm not disputing Officer Mitchell's testimony. I'm acknowledging that we have serious problems that require immediate attention. Judge Washington pulled out a thick folder from his desk. Chief Morrison, I have here 47 sworn statements from citizens describing encounters with Officer Mitchell and other members of your department. These statements detail patterns of excessive force, racial profiling, false arrests, and abuse of authority dating back more than 5 years. He held up the folder for the courtroom to see. Were you aware of these complaints? Morrison's face went pale. Your Honor, I was aware of some complaints against Officer Mitchell, but I wasn't aware of the full scope of the problem. Chief Morrison, isn't it your responsibility as the head of the police department to be aware of patterns of misconduct among your officers? Yes, Your Honor, it is. And isn't it your responsibility to take corrective action when such patterns are identified? Yes, Your Honor. Then would you agree that you have failed in your responsibilities as Chief of Police? The question hung in the air like a sword. Morrison's career, his reputation, and his legacy all balanced on his answer. Yes, Your Honor, I have failed in my responsibilities. Judge Washington made notes before continuing. Chief Morrison, if I were to renew the Sheriff's Department bond unconditionally, what assurance can you give this court that similar incidents will not occur in the future? Morrison looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Your Honor, we would implement additional training and review our policies to prevent similar incidents. Chief, you've had years to implement training and review policies. Why should this court believe that you will be more effective going forward than you have been in the past? Morrison had no good answer to this question, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. Judge Washington called several more witnesses, including Keisha Johnson, who presented the comprehensive reform proposal that had been developed with community input and expert consultation. The proposed reforms were extensive: mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight boards, bias training, de-escalation protocols, transparent complaint processes, and regular community meetings. As the testimony concluded and the hearing moved toward closing arguments, the weight of what had been revealed settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, it was about an entire system that had failed to protect the citizens it was supposed to serve. Harold Stevens rose to present his closing argument, though he looked like a man who knew his case was lost before he began speaking. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Officer Mitchell's behavior was unacceptable and that the police department has areas that need improvement, we urge the court not to punish the entire law enforcement community for the actions of one individual. He gestured toward Chief Morrison. Chief Morrison has acknowledged the problems and committed to addressing them. The department serves the community faithfully every day, and depriving them of their bond would harm public safety more than it would help. Stevens sat down, his argument brief because there was simply no effective defense for what had been revealed during the hearing. Keisha Johnson rose to present the case for comprehensive reform. Your Honor, what we've heard today is not the story of one bad officer, but the story of a system that has consistently failed to hold its members accountable. Officer Mitchell's behavior was enabled by supervisors who ignored complaints, policies that were inadequate to prevent abuse, and a culture that prioritized protecting officers over protecting citizens. She held up the folder of citizen complaints. 47 people came forward to describe similar experiences. 47 citizens who were failed by the system that was supposed to protect them. How many more never came forward? How many more suffered in silence because they believed no one would listen or care? Keisha's voice grew stronger as she continued. Judge Washington was fortunate because his position gave him power to fight back. But what about the teenager who was arrested for walking home from school? What about the mother who was humiliated during a traffic stop? What about the elderly man who was roughed up for asking questions about a parking citation? She turned to face the gallery, addressing not just Judge Washington but the entire community. Your Honor, you have the power to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. You have the authority to require real, meaningful reform that will protect every citizen of Montgomery County, regardless of their race, their economic status, or their ability to fight back. The reforms we've proposed aren't punitive, they're protective. They're designed to help good officers do their jobs better while preventing bad officers from abusing their authority. They represent the community's demand for accountability and justice. Keisha returned to her seat, her argument complete. Judge Washington called for a final recess before rendering his decision. As the courtroom cleared for the break, speculation ran wild about what he might decide. Some believed he would deny the bond entirely, effectively shutting down police operations until reforms were implemented. Others thought he might impose moderate conditions that would allow the department to continue operating while making gradual improvements. But those who knew Judge Washington best understood that his decision would be guided not by emotion or revenge, but by a careful consideration of what would best serve justice and the community. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Washington returned to the bench carrying a thick document that would soon reshape law enforcement in Montgomery County. This court has heard extensive testimony about serious failures in police accountability and community relations, he began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. The evidence presented demonstrates not isolated incidents of misconduct, but systemic problems that have persisted for years without adequate response from department leadership. He held up Mitchell's arrest report. Officer Mitchell's false arrest report represents more than individual misconduct. It represents a willingness to manipulate the justice system to avoid accountability. Such behavior strikes at the very heart of our constitutional protections. Judge Washington set down the document and looked directly at Chief Morrison. Chief Morrison's testimony revealed a leadership failure that enabled and perpetuated these problems. A police chief who is unaware of patterns of misconduct among his officers has failed in his most basic responsibility to the community. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of clothing as people shifted nervously in their seats. However, Judge Washington continued, this court also recognizes that the Montgomery Police Department provides essential services to our community. Public safety cannot be compromised even as we demand accountability and reform. He picked up the thick document he had brought to the bench. Therefore, this court hereby renews the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department bond, subject to the following comprehensive conditions that must be implemented within 90 days. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom. The department would continue operating, but clearly with significant restrictions. Judge Washington began reading from the reform document. First, all officers must complete 40 hours of bias training and de-escalation training within 60 days, with annual refresher courses thereafter. Second, all patrol officers must wear body cameras that record continuously during interactions with the public, with footage to be preserved for a minimum of 2 years. Third, a civilian oversight board with subpoena power will be established to investigate complaints against police officers, with board members selected through a community nomination process. Fourth, the police department will implement an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of complaints or use of force incidents, with mandatory intervention and additional training for officers who exceed established thresholds. Fifth, the department will establish a transparent complaint process with public reporting of complaint statistics, investigation outcomes, and disciplinary actions taken. Sixth, monthly community meetings will be held in each district with attendance by senior police officials required to provide forums for citizen concerns and police community dialogue. Judge Washington paused, allowing the weight of these requirements to sink in before continuing. Seventh, all arrests must be reviewed by supervisors within 24 hours, with particular attention to use of force incidents and arrests that result in dropped charges. Eighth, the department will partner with community organizations to develop cultural competency training that addresses the historical relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. Ninth, promotion and assignment decisions will include community input through the Civilian Oversight Board, ensuring that officers with histories of misconduct are not placed in positions of increased authority. 10th, The department will implement a zero-tolerance policy for racial language, excessive force, and false reporting, with violations resulting in immediate termination. The comprehensive nature of the reforms was staggering. Judge Washington wasn't just addressing the immediate problems. He was restructuring the entire relationship between the police department and the community it served. These conditions are not suggestions or goals, Judge Washington emphasized. They are legal requirements for maintaining the department's operational bond. Failure to implement any of these reforms within the specified time frame will result in immediate bond revocation. He turned his attention to specific individuals. Officer Ryan Mitchell, you are hereby ordered to surrender your law enforcement certification pending criminal investigation by the State Attorney General's office. Your testimony today, while commendable for its honesty, cannot undo the harm you have caused to individual citizens and to public trust in law enforcement. Mitchell nodded, having expected this outcome. His law enforcement career was over, but his cooperation might help him avoid the worst criminal penalties. Chief Morrison, you have 90 days to demonstrate that you can implement these reforms effectively. If you cannot or will not provide the leadership necessary to transform this department, this court will recommend to the mayor that new leadership be found. Morrison's face was grim, but he nodded his understanding. His career was hanging by a thread, dependent entirely on his ability to change a culture he had helped create. Judge Washington's voice grew more personal as he addressed the broader implications of the case. The incident that brought us here today was not an anomaly. It was the predictable result of a system that has failed to hold itself accountable. When I was arrested for doing my job as a parking enforcement volunteer, I experienced firsthand what too many citizens of Montgomery County have endured for too long. He gestured toward the gallery where community members sat. But I was fortunate. My position gave me power to fight back, resources to defend myself, and a platform to demand justice. Most citizens who encounter police misconduct have none of these advantages. They suffer in silence, their complaints ignored, their dignity trampled, their trust in justice destroyed. Today's decision is not about revenge against Officer Mitchell or punishment of the police department. It is about ensuring that every citizen of Montgomery County, regardless of race, economic status, or social position, can expect to be treated with dignity and respect by those sworn to protect and serve. Judge Washington stood, his imposing presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. To the officers of the Montgomery Police Department who serve with honor and integrity, these reforms will support your work and help you build stronger relationships with the community. To those officers who view these changes as burdensome restrictions, I suggest you consider a different line of work. To the citizens of Montgomery County, particularly those who have been failed by the system in the past, these reforms represent our commitment to justice and accountability. But reforms alone are not enough. True change requires ongoing community engagement and vigilance. He picked up his gavel, preparing to close the hearing. This court will review implementation of these reforms in 90 days. If substantial progress has not been made, or if new incidents of misconduct suggest that cultural change is not occurring, additional measures will be imposed. The bond is renewed conditionally, effective immediately. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom and beyond, marking not just the end of a hearing but the beginning of a new era in Montgomery County law enforcement. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause, conversation, and activity as reporters rushed to file their stories and community members discussed the implications of what they had witnessed. Some police officers left looking angry and resentful, while others seemed relieved that a path forward had been established. Judge Washington remained at the bench for several minutes, accepting congratulations from community leaders and answering questions from his staff about implementation timelines. His expression was serious but satisfied. He had used his authority not for personal revenge but for systemic reform. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Keisha Johnson approached the bench. "Judge," she said, "this is unprecedented. You've created a template for police accountability that could be used across the country." Judge Washington nodded thoughtfully. "Keisha, what happened here today was only possible because of the community support and legal expertise that people like you provided. Real change doesn't come from judges or laws alone. It comes from citizens who refuse to accept injustice and who work together to demand better." Jerome Williams joined them, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and determination. "Judge, the NAACP is committed to monitoring implementation of these reforms. We'll be watching closely to ensure that promises become reality." "I'm counting on that, Jerome. These reforms will only work if the community remains engaged and holds everyone accountable for following through." Outside the courthouse, the media had assembled for what would become a historic press conference. Judge Washington stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by community leaders and civil rights advocates, as dozens of cameras recorded his words. "Today's hearing was about more than one incident or one officer," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "It was about whether we will tolerate a system that treats some citizens as less worthy of respect and protection than others. The reforms implemented today represent a new compact between law enforcement and the community. Police officers will have the training, oversight, and support they need to serve effectively while being held accountable for their actions. Citizens will have meaningful ways to report problems and participate in ensuring that their police department reflects their values." A reporter called out a question. "Judge Washington, some critics say you used your personal experience to impose reforms that go beyond your legal authority. How do you respond?" Judge Washington's answer was measured but firm. "Every decision I made today was based on extensive legal research, community input, and documented evidence of systemic problems. My personal experience with Officer Mitchell informed my understanding of these issues, but it did not drive my decision-making. The authority to impose these conditions comes from state law governing public safety bonds and from this community's right to expect accountability from its public servants. If anyone believes I exceeded my authority, they are free to appeal through appropriate channels." Another reporter asked about the broader implications of the case. "Judge, do you believe other communities should implement similar reforms?" "I believe every community should examine its police accountability systems and ask whether they adequately protect citizens' rights while supporting effective law enforcement. The specific reforms we implemented today were tailored to Montgomery County's needs, but the principles of transparency, accountability, and community engagement are universal." As the press conference concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Judge Washington reflected on the events that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a routine afternoon volunteering with parking enforcement had evolved into a comprehensive examination of police accountability and community relations. Officer Mitchell's decision to assault and falsely arrest him had been intended to assert dominance and avoid consequences. Instead, it had triggered a process that would transform law enforcement in Montgomery County and potentially serve as a model for communities across the nation. The irony was profound. Mitchell's attempt to silence and intimidate someone he saw as powerless had instead amplified voices that had been ignored for too long and created new mechanisms for accountability that would protect citizens for years to come. 3 months later, the first progress review hearing painted a mixed but encouraging picture. The police department had implemented most of the required reforms, though some changes were proceeding more slowly than others. Body cameras were in use, bias training had been completed, and the Civilian Oversight Board was operational. More importantly, early indicators suggested that the culture within the department was beginning to shift. Complaint numbers had actually increased initially, which reformers interpreted as a positive sign that citizens felt more confident about reporting problems. But excessive force incidents had decreased significantly, and community satisfaction with police interactions was showing measurable improvement. Officer Mitchell had pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations and been sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. His cooperation with ongoing investigations into police misconduct had resulted in additional reforms and disciplinary actions against other officers and supervisors. Chief Morrison had been replaced after it became clear that he could not effectively lead the cultural transformation required by the reforms. His successor, chosen through a process that included significant community input, was a reform-minded chief from another state with a proven track record of implementing police accountability measures. Judge Washington continued his volunteer work with parking enforcement, though he now traveled with a security detail due to threats from those who opposed the reforms. He had received speaking invitations from law schools, police academies, and community organizations across the country, all seeking to understand how Montgomery County had achieved such comprehensive police reform. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between the police department and the community it served. The monthly community meetings were well attended and had become forums for collaborative problem-solving rather than adversarial confrontations. Citizens who had previously avoided any contact with police were participating in ride-along programs and community policing initiatives. The transformation wasn't complete, and challenges remained. Some officers had resigned rather than accept the new accountability measures, and there were ongoing tensions between traditional law enforcement approaches and the community-oriented model being implemented. But the foundation had been laid for a new kind of policing, one based on mutual respect, transparency, and shared responsibility for community safety. What had started with one officer's abuse of power had become a comprehensive reimagining of the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens they served. As Judge Washington often said in his speeches about the case, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved becomes a foundation for further progress." The parking lot where it all began had been renamed the Community Justice Plaza, with a plaque commemorating not the confrontation that occurred there, but the reforms that emerged from it. The inscription read, "In recognition that true authority comes not from power over others, but from service to justice and equality for all." And every day, as police officers and citizens went about their business in Montgomery County, they did so under a system that had been fundamentally transformed by one man's refusal to accept injustice and one community's determination to demand better. The truth, as Judge Washington had promised Officer Mitchell, had indeed found a way, and in finding its way, it had lit a path toward a more just future for everyone.